My name is Julia.
And I'm Sabrina.
And this is our podcast, Trans Inside. We wanted to make a podcast to sort of bring people to the issue of working with gender diverse clients who have experiences with carceral systems. We're specifically wanting to sort of discuss what can be done differently, both on a system policy level and as a social worker, a support worker, how can you support these people? Because I think we can come to this issue with a lot of empathy and really caring for people in their lives. So just a bit of content forecasting. We are going to be discussing issues of violence, including sexual, physical, and emotional violence, as well as discrimination. And these things are happening on both policy and individual scales. So just to get started on our first episode, we're going to be discussing a little bit of the context and the history of this issue. So to start, one big thing we want to hit on is that while you may see certain numbers, you may think that this doesn't affect a lot of people, I would argue that one person, that's their real life, and we should, be wanting to make sure that they're having a successful transition either through the prison system, out of prison. And two, I think you had a lot to add about this, about how this is kind of an undercount.
Yeah, I personally, just based on the data that we're seeing, there's firstly not a lot of data about gender diverse and trans individuals in Canadian prisons. We know that there is some data about American prisons, but as of right now, there's only one report from Corrections Canada that actually has a demographic profile of gender diverse individuals within the Canadian prison system, and based on their estimates is that it's around 0.4% of the prison population. But we do know that a lot of people are not feeling comfortable to come out in prison, or maybe waiting, and a lot based on the research that we're seeing is a lot of people are waiting to come out until they've left prison, or they're only coming out if they're serving a long-term sentence. So because of the heightened violence in a prison setting, that makes you a target. So a lot of people aren't coming out.
Yeah, and there's also this other thing that's happening where gender issues and biological sex is not as black and white or categorizable as maybe we want it to be. So I owe a lot of debt to Julia Sudbury, who's an academic who wrote an article about this, and she said, in addition to trans prisoners who may or may not be transitioning medically in prisons, prisons are a place of heightened gender expression. There's, butch lesbians, feminine gay men, transgender, genderqueer, two-spirited people who may or may not identify as trans, male, female. And part of this is this really heightened space. And part of it is that trans and gender nonconforming people are more likely to be involved in these systems. They're more likely to be stopped by the police because of high rates of homelessness, involvement in street economies, that when you don't have as many great options, say you've been kicked out of your home, and because of police profiling and harassment. So this leads to gender non-conforming people being stuck in sort of a cycle of poverty, which leads them to face criminalization, and then they have, a harder time getting a job afterwards because of their criminal record, and it leads to sort of this cycle where trans people can become sort of in and out of prisons.
Yeah, and like you said, the prison system is a really binary system. We have men's prisons and women's prisons, and in Canada, we only have 6 institutions for women federally, and then roughly, give or take, about 53 institutions for men. So, right there, there's a big, sex difference in prison settings to begin with.
And that also brings another point I want to get across for our viewers, is that we're going to be focusing a lot on federal policy, because in Canada there's federal corrections, there's provincial corrections, and then there might be, a holding cell you're in if you've been arrested municipally. And these all have their own separate policies. And, some provincial systems are doing a lot better, some are doing a lot worse, but when a person has been convicted of a crime and having a sentence of more than 2 years, depending on what the offense specifically was, they are then going to be placed in a federal corrections institution, and that's where a lot of these issues are happening right now. So the other thing I want to really get across before we go into sort of the history of this is, if you the same way me and Sabrina wanted to learn more, wanted to really understand what's happening and how to help people, you might be misled by Correctional Services Canada. Because what they're saying is happening when we talk to people on the ground, both service providers and trans people themselves, this is not what's happening. So Correctional Service Canada says that prisoners retain all the rights of members of society, except for those that have to be removed because you're, restricted into a prison. But they say, we're placing people out unless there's this overriding health and security concern. We're realizing that almost everybody's being placed in this loophole. There is a denial of adequate medical treatment to transgender prisoners through, what is happening with medical transitions. And this becomes a form of, state violence that's being enacted on people. And one of the things is, even under this quote-unquote policy that they have that they think is really great, CESC currently refuses to change people's gender on their prison ID cards unless they undergo a complete transition, quote unquote, including both top and bottom surgeries and hormone treatment. So that creates a system where not everyone wants a full medical treatment for whatever reason.
B, how difficult is it to access a surgery like that in a prison setting where maybe you're a trans woman in an all-male prison, right? And you are wanting to, because it's segregated by sex, you're placed perhaps in a men's prison, which it seems like overwhelmingly trans women are being placed in men's prisons despite changes to the law in 2017. Why would you want to undergo that surgery when you're at risk of victimization and violence? Mm-hmm. And even accessing it, right? Yeah. And even being able to, attain those services. Just to access mental health services and, healthcare services in a prison setting to begin with is difficult. So to access gender affirming care is even more so.
And that brings in the intersectionality piece quite well, I think, is that a prison is already a state of violence, victimization, a lack of care, a lack of medical care. And so when you are trans or trans and Black or trans and Indigenous, once it becomes even heightened and even more vulnerable and even more victimizing. So you sort of have all your current problems that everyone has, and you have this extra layer of things being really difficult to access, and there being really a lack of dignity being given to you.
I want to just also go back to when you mentioned the overriding security concern, because basically, we'll get to this a little bit more later, but since 2017, they've said, okay, you can go to an institution based on your gender identity, right? Unless there's an overriding security concern. But if you're in a prison setting, you already have a sentence that's over 2 years and a day because of a crime. I think it could be argued for many people that you're an overriding security concern.
Yeah.
Right? That's a very vague policy.
There's a lack of definition, and there's a lack of, when there's no definition, you can sort of apply it however you want.
Yeah, and that's what we see with a lot of policies like that can be applied in a way that harms people. when there's not really like clear guidelines and there's not really much staff training, right? Like you think of prison guards. I mean, CSC says that they're training prison guards in LGBTQ issues, but how much training and how thorough is that training, right? Yeah. And I mean, based on what I've heard from working with individuals that have been incarcerated, is the prison guard that you get makes a huge difference on your experience in the prison. Just like your, you know, PO makes a huge difference. So maybe you get somebody that has more experience in training. That's great. But if you don't, then what recourse do you have? You don't have, I mean, your rights are being stripped away by being in prison to begin with.
Yeah, and that reminds me of, just to talk a little bit about how we approach this issue, can you talk a little bit about how you come to... So my background is as a support worker. I mean, I've worked with individuals that are gender diverse and have experiences within the carceral system. And some of my clients have talked to me about their stories and about their experience in the prison setting. And it made such an impression on me that I wanted to understand this issue further. And just you know, to like, it's such an understudied area. And I think, like, especially, I mean, we're both in the social work program at Carleton. And I think that there's such a lack of research and material in the curriculum about trans issues and about criminal justice issues, when social workers work with people in the criminal justice system all the time, and we work with the LGBTQ population all the time because of so many structural factors. And it feels like a disservice that there's not enough research and enough material to adequately, like, give social workers the tools they need to be able to actually serve this population. So that was part of the reason that we wanted to create this podcast. And yeah, even like, because you might think, as, you know, I'm not going to have to know about this because, say, I work at a women's shelter. Like, no matter where you go as a social worker, and I imagine on some level I'm speaking to the choir, but you're going to encounter trans issues and criminal justice issues. Like, a women's shelter is a perfect example. Yeah, I mean, peace bonds, your partner being incarcerated, maybe you had to fight back for your own protection, but that, you know, ended up with a carceral encounter. So these issues go no matter where how you work. Trans individuals experience intimate partner violence at a much higher rate than the general population. So we personally believe that this is an issue that is of great importance to all social workers, support workers, anyone working with vulnerable, impoverished people. So then, with that in mind, I would like to a little bit go through the history of this. The first thing is that, again, just repeating, trans people have existed forever. Trans people are going to exist forever. And as long as there's been systems of incarceration, there's been trans people in those systems. So we can think back to when cross-dressing was illegal. Like, you could be incarcerated for being trans. But starting in the 1970s, there started to be an increase in political prisoners, specifically looking at First Nations, resistant to the idea of Canada. There's sort of these threats to national security, and this fed into an understanding of the role of the prison in sort of perpetuating state repression against these maybe communities that we don't want to develop that level of resistance. And so that happens with First Nations and Indigenous communities. And since these, you know, a person is not one identity, like, these things start to go hand in hand. So this sort of happens on a really ad hoc but also incredibly conservative way of dealing with this until the 2001 Human Rights Council decision, which one of the big finding is the tribunal one investigating this for the human rights decision found that trans women must undergo surgery to be placed in a women's facility, but that gender affirmation surgery can be considered an essential medical service and that the correctional services is expected to cover the cost. So this created a system where, again, there is that binary, you have to get the surgery that's really hard to get that we have discussed. But what this Human Rights Council decision did is that this is an essential medical service and people should be able to access it. And because you're restricting this person to the prison, you as the prison system must cover it. Then in 2015, there was the West Coast Prison Justice Society complaint, which is an organization that works on behalf of incarcerated people. And they really brought up the issues that we're going to be discussing today. So that when trans women go in male prisons, they're more likely to be put in protective custody, which is like, there's different words, administrative segregation. Like, it is solitary. Mm-hmm. Like, it is difficult. It has all the mental health concerns we have of solitary in other situations, but we've sort of labeled it protective, and we said, like, this is how we're protecting people. And yet they like bear the brunt of that.
Protecting who, right? I mean, you're put in segregation, which is no longer called segregation, but is essentially that. And we know that there's an intersection of mental health concerns and people who are gender diverse having more likely to be experiencing mental health concerns due to a number of structural factors. And then you're put in solitary, right? And you have like a social worker come to visit you every day for an hour, and then the rest of the time you're in a cold room alone, no blanket, nothing. You're just in a gown, right? And I mean, how like dehumanizing is that? But then they have this same concern of, and this leads to our bigger thing of what will become apparent is CSE remains unclear of how to protect prisoners. Because at the same time, the West Coast Prison Justice Society argued that the allowance of double bunking or cell sharing between trans women and male prisoners has resulted in women being put in constant risk of sexual violence. Mm-hmm. So prisoners got to decide at this time, again, this was in 2015, whether male or female were frisked or strip search and conduct urinalysis on prisoners. They had no say over that. I would also quote Angela Davis in this moment, who discusses strip searching as state-sanctioned sexual violence. So, again, you have the violence on behalf of the prisoners and the guards. Yeah. I mean, what it looks like realistically in a prison setting is that if you are a trans woman transitioning from like a biological gender marker male, right, and you start hormones because of the wait time to get a gender affirming surgery, what it looks like in practice in frisking is that you have a woman who strip searches the top half of you because you're on hormones and you are developing breasts, and then you have a male prison guard strip searching the bottom half of you because you, according to that, still have quote unquote male genitalia.
And so, I mean, objectively, like, that is happening, and it does sound silly, but that is the same, like, kind of, like, you're all like almost not eroticized but exoticized, like sort of this zoo animal within like this really terrible environment trying to get care. The West Coast Prison Justice complaint also brought up the issue of sharing bathrooms with non-trans prisoners. This, again, any situation where there isn't cameras, there's a mixing, like, it really impacts safety. It also really aggravates, like, mental health, body image for you to be in quote unquote a male bathroom as a woman, saying, well, you get to be there because I've decided that having a penis makes someone objectively a male. So like all those body image, mental health concerns are happening at the same time.
On top of the safety concern of being in a space with a bunch of men with no camera, no recourse, and nobody looking out for you if you do report it.
So from this complaint, the Correctional Service Canada changed its placement and accommodation policies to this case-by-case basis, which, as we can probably imagine, leads to some other concerns. Like, who is getting approved, who is not getting approved, what are the reasons they're not getting approved? Like, it opens up the space to a lot of biases to come into play, and for you not to maybe have to make justifications about why you put someone where, and that they then just have to deal with the consequences.
Yeah.
So then there was this thing called the Kavanaugh decisions. So Cynthia Kavanaugh had lived as a woman since she was 13. She was incarcerated, and then in 1993 she filed complaints because the correctional services refused to give her an adequate hormone dosage to prevent the reversal of physical changes she had undergone prior to in prison. They denied it several times. They denied her request for gender affirmation surgery several times. She, to the court, described all the difficulties she had as a trans woman in a male prison. So the humiliating experiences of showering with male prisoners, being strip searched. She spent quite a bit of time in segregation. She was assaulted, harassed, taunted. She eventually won her case, and that's what's referred to as the Kavanaugh decision, and she was finally transferred to a female prison, but she still, had those horrific experiences that she had to go through. In some way, we have these interesting relationships with the people in the stories who go through this to make these changes, because did they make, is this, they went through this horrible experience and now things are supposed to be quote unquote better, but they didn't get to decide that would be how it went,
And how many people go through those same experiences and simply do not have the ability to go through the process of filing a human rights complaint? Or what if they start a human rights complaint and they're not adequately supported throughout the process and they lose their case? I mean, how much further? Well, I mean, we talk about, how difficult it is to be a victim of sexual violence and to testify against your abuser in a court setting. And how difficult must that be for a trans individual who is already dealing with multiple, intersecting identities that are being oppressed, such as, being an incarcerated person. So they're already being discriminated against and stereotyped against. And then, they're a victim of assault. And like, there's the fact that people might not believe them or might not take them seriously. And how re-traumatizing is it to go through that experience? And I mean, that's amazing that she did that.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's humiliating to have to go through an experience like that. And that's the only way to change it. I mean, it doesn't make sense.
So this sort of combined with, because this happened in 2017, and as recently as January of that year, like the policy still dictated that trans prisoners be assigned based on preoperative sex. So in 2017, through this case, they found that trans prisoners were not getting healthcare even when they were entitled to it. So we previously discussed, like, CSA must pay for surgery. This involves the doctors. So many doctors were not aware that they were able to prescribe hormonal therapy for their trans patients, because one of the things that can happen is the disconnect between your healthcare providers outside and then you're placed inside the prison. This again meant that CSE must pay for care, but prisoners were only eligible if they had lived in that sort of identity congruent gender role for 12 months. And the surgery was recommended by this specialist, again, knowing that the doctors didn't have enough knowledge.
Right. So we see how, like, bureaucratic processes can be weaponized against people. I mean, even if there's the best of intentions to say, like, yes, you know, CSC needs to cover this. I mean, if somebody doesn't want it to happen, they can put bureaucratic obstacles in place.
Well, then I also think about people who come out in prison. You have to live in the gender identity congruent role for a year.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing that if you're a trans woman in a men's prison.
Right.
So they're asking you to act, you know, but are they giving you access to female clothing? Are they giving you access to those, like, gender affirming tools that you need?
Right. And if you're taking hormones, there's the risk that, you know, what I hear from previous clients is that when you're taking hormones is that you lose muscle mass, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're undergoing different changes to your body that could make you, you know, more easily victimized by your peers in a prison setting.
And the other thing that happened from this is that the Commissioner of Corrections was supposed to ensure that staff who have regular contact with trans prisoners have the necessary knowledge to respond to that. But this is the thing with the federal policy, is they just say that we're doing this. There's no clear definition about what that means. Like, is there follow through to make sure this is happening? What kind of training is it?
There's not very much transparency. I mean, when you go on the CSC website, I mean, I'm seeing, you know, they have some things. They have, you know, a singular study about gender diverse demographics in prisons, and, you know, they have, you know, some tips about case management and an action plan, but, like, nothing really like concrete.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing that, like, you know, it just feels like there could be so much more here. Like, they could be doing a lot more. I mean, it's a start, but, like, when you think about demographics in a prison setting, I mean, we have pretty detailed racial demographics in prisons, and, you know, we have a breakdown of data showing the differences in sex reported in prisons, right? But, like, we don't have a lot of data about gender diverse individuals. I mean, we have one singular study. I mean, how are we supposed to make policy recommendations if we don't have adequate data?
And that, again, makes that understanding the intersectionality piece really difficult.
Yeah.
Because often these studies are done separated, and there might be, say, more studies on race and less studies, as you say, on gender diversity. So trying to understand the experience of Black trans women is really hard to do with the data we have.
Right, and how is that data being consumed by the general public? I mean, like, when you're looking at the way that, like, even just trying to do research for the podcast, we're finding so much, you know, right-wing,
I would say clearly, and
transphobic articles that are misrepresenting the one study that's being done. I mean, how much can we conclude based on one study? That to me seems like, you know, no wonder it's so politically driven. Like, it's already politically driven. And then you have, you know, right, this MacDonald Laurier writing opinion pieces about gender diverse prisoners and making really big conclusions, really sweeping overgeneralizations based on CSC's one study. I mean, CSC clearly could be more transparent with the data that they're putting out about gender diverse individuals. And then, you know, like, I mean,
and then the transgender and gender diverse incarcerated people are the ones caught in the middle.
Right, in this political storm, right? And it's like, we forget that these are real people, that these massive political conversations, they affect their day-to-day life and their safety. And you know, when we think about the history of, you know, incarceration, like, you think it's a violent system, and now you're causing further violence. Like, it's portrayed in such a way that it's the trans men that are perpetuating the violence, right? But we see, like, well, I mean, I don't know, but it seems to me from what I hear that it is that a lot of trans prisoners have dealt with violence themselves.
And that gets into a piece by Westbrook and Schultz in 2014 talking sort of about how our sex panics and our idea of, like, sexual violence in specifically gender segregated spaces really has to do with inherently painting people in these really key boxes of men and women. Men as inherently violent, women as inherently being victimized. So that allows them to take the idea of a trans woman who is not a man, like, is a woman, and many people identify as a trans woman in particular. Some people only identify as a woman, and makes them out to be, you know, this violent, out of control, irrational. And so they're easily painted as the villain, especially when, like you said, the data is incomplete, easily generalized. There's no follow-up to how that data is being used. So then I just wanted to pull back a second to, we were talking about the medical model that's happening here and how that medical care is being given out. And one other big piece that people inside and people who care for these people are responding to is the need of a dysphoria diagnosis. So when there's a likelihood that a prisoner or incarcerated person is experiencing gender dysphoria, they're meant to be referred to a psychiatrist. Again, we have questions on how much this is actually happening, what knowledge the psychiatrist has. But this makes it such that you can only get care if you have this diagnosis. So this can maybe not fit for people who exist in sort of the middle, like non-binary, intersex folks. B, like, for people who are Indigenous, trans, and two-spirit peoples, their genders may be larger than discrepancies between gender and identity and sex assigned to them at birth. It's a much more spiritual, cultural, and again, I want to reiterate, like, we are not personally Indigenous folks, but we want to, you know, work on behalf and be good allies. So I just think that's relevant to this point right here. But those people are not being captured by this. So then they're fully cut off by medical care because either they don't want to or they can't get this dysphoria diagnosis. And then that leads into the mental health, because dysphoria is considered a mental health disorder. There's continues, like we said, all these same problems you have in other incarcerated folks. Like, there's a lack of access to adequate mental health services in prisons. There's a lack of qualified medical health professionals in corrections. There's a lot of stigmas both within, you know, incarcerated folks, within guards, around mental health issues. And then there's no community reintegration. So if you got mental health care in the prison, no, again, that same existing issue of you're not being set up for success when you finish your sentence.
Yeah, there's such a lack of transitional housing in Canada and in Ontario generally, right? And there's such a lack of support services for incarcerated people leaving incarceration, let alone, I mean, mental health services, right? I mean, like, there's the John Howard Society, and there's, you know, some different community health agencies and some partners, but really a lot of it relies on nonprofit agencies in the community.
And the medical health professionals within the prison, to be clear here, have reporting that they must do. So they must report a patient's health outcomes to be used for parole hearings.
Right. I mean, how are you able to, you know, build a therapeutic relationship with a mental health practitioner in a prison setting when they have to report your very personal and sensitive information to the parole board?
So through our history and through, issues of count and how the data is being reported, we've come to the big current mess. So the big current mess is people aren't being placed in the way they say they are. Mm-hmm. They're not being placed on identity.
I just also wanted to draw attention to this statistic from Corrections Canada saying that 2/3, 67% of trans women are placed in men's facilities, and this is data from 2022.
So exactly right there. Like, on some level, the policy people at Correctional Service Canada know this is happening.
Yeah, but trans men were more likely to be in women's facilities. 95% of them were in women's facilities, which I think kind of speaks to Westbrook and Schultz' article about gender panic and women being seen as vulnerable. So therefore, trans men are seen as vulnerable as well and are still being placed in women's prisons, whereas trans women are being placed in men's facilities.
Because
by and large,
this scary, gotta protect people. Yeah. And so there's a lack of adequate medical protection. There's a lack of protection in general. They don't know what to do. And it leads to situations like what we said, where from 2017, specific policies on searching in urinalysis state, respectively, that searching, including strip searching, will consider the mixed gender physiology. I don't know that many trans of women that we're talking about consider themselves to be mixed gender. They probably consider themselves to be trans women. Yeah. Also, the non-binary people I know may not describe themselves as mixed gender. And this leads to this situation where the trans woman will have a female officer search the top part of her body and a male officer search the bottom half of their body. One thing that's interesting about this policy is that urinalysis is still based on biological sex. Mm-hmm. So it's, if you're a trans woman, a man coming into the bathroom stall with you to watch you pee into a cup.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's sort of our first episode. Thank you for coming on this journey.
Thank you for listening.
We encourage you to listen to our next episode where we're going to dive a little bit deeper on the current situation and then what, both on a policy level we might be working towards and on an individual micro sitting with clients. Yeah. So thank you so much. We'll see you next time.